You know that moment late at night when everything is quiet, your phone is in your hand, you've already told yourself you're going to sleep, but instead you scroll. Not because you really want to, but because something inside you feels restless. A strange mix of boredom, tension, and curiosity. You open that site you've opened many times before, and while you're watching, there's this strange feeling in the background. Part of you is engaged, another part of you is already tired of it. You tell yourself this is the last time, just tonight. But somehow that same moment happens again and again and again, until eventually you stop asking why it keeps happening. You just accept that it does. If that pattern feels familiar, there's something important to understand. Because most people talk about this behavior in a very strange way. They talk about it with shame, with moral panic, or with simple advice that sounds easy but rarely works. They say things like, just stop, have more discipline, it's ruining your life. But those explanations rarely reach the real reason people fall into this cycle. And when people feel misunderstood, they stop talking about it. They hide it and assume something is wrong with them. But psychology usually sees something different. Not a flaw, a pattern. A pattern that makes sense once you understand what the brain is trying to do. And the behavior we're quietly talking about here is the cycle of pornography and masturbation addiction. Not occasional curiosity, not normal sexuality, but that repeating pattern where it feels like the behavior is running on autopilot. The strange part is that many people who experience this cycle aren't weak, they're not reckless. Many of them are actually thoughtful people, self-aware, often introspective, which makes the cycle even more confusing because the person experiencing it often knows they don't really want to keep doing it, but the brain keeps pulling them back. And when people try to explain this, they usually oversimplify it. They talk about temptation, but rarely about neuroscience. Because what's happening here has very little to do with willpower and almost everything to do with how the brain handles stress, reward, and escape. Inside the brain, there's a chemical called dopamine. Most people hear about dopamine and think it means pleasure, but that's not exactly what it does. Dopamine is actually about anticipation. It's the brain's signal that something interesting might happen, something rewarding, something stimulating. And the brain loves shortcuts to dopamine, especially when those shortcuts are fast, private, and always available. A few decades ago, those shortcuts were rare, but now they live in people's pockets. One search, one click, instant stimulation. The brain learns very quickly. This works. So the next time someone feels bored, lonely, anxious, or overwhelmed, the brain remembers the fastest way to shift that feeling, and that memory becomes a loop. Not because the person is weak, but because the brain is extremely efficient at repeating what relieves discomfort. Behavioral scientists call this reinforcement learning. When something changes your emotional state quickly, the brain marks it as useful, and it wants to repeat it, especially if it works instantly. Pornography happens to be one of the fastest dopamine triggers the brain can access. It requires almost no effort, no social interaction, no risk of rejection, just stimulation, which is why the brain begins associating it with relief. But there's another piece of this pattern people rarely talk about: the nervous system. Human beings are constantly regulating emotional tension. Some people talk to friends, some people exercise, some people distract themselves with work or entertainment. But when someone repeatedly turns to sexual stimulation for emotional regulation, the brain quietly rewires around it. It becomes a coping strategy, not always a conscious one, but a learned one. And most coping strategies begin somewhere earlier in life. For some people, the habit starts in adolescence, a time when curiosity is high, emotions are intense, and the brain is still learning how to manage stress. When someone discovers that sexual stimulation can quickly change their mood, the brain stores that discovery. It becomes a private tool,
And over time, the brain starts reaching for that tool automatically, especially during certain emotional states: loneliness, frustration, rejection, boredom, even success sometimes. Because dopamine isn't only triggered by negative emotions, it's triggered by intensity. And pornography offers intensity without effort. But there's something else that slowly happens in the background. The brain adapts. What once felt stimulating becomes normal. The brain's reward system slowly becomes less sensitive, which means the person often needs more stimulation to feel the same effect, more novelty, more intensity, more time spent searching. Not because they want more, but because the brain is trying to recreate the same dopamine spike it once felt easily. This is called desensitization, and it happens in many forms of behavioral addiction: gaming, social media, gambling. The brain simply adapts to repeated stimulation, so the behavior increases. And then something interesting happens. After the stimulation fades, the brain experiences a temporary dopamine drop, which can create feelings of fatigue, irritability, or emptiness. And ironically, that uncomfortable state can push the brain to seek the same stimulation again, not for pleasure this time, but for relief, which is how cycles form. Pleasure becomes habit, habit becomes escape, escape becomes dependency. And yet, despite how common this pattern is, people rarely talk about it calmly. Instead, the conversation becomes moral, or dramatic, or judgmental, which makes people hide. But from a psychological perspective, behaviors like this are simply nervous system regulation strategies, some helpful, some less helpful, but all understandable. There's also something else hidden in this pattern, something that surprises many people. People who fall into pornography and masturbation addiction are often people with strong inner worlds, imaginative minds, sensitive nervous systems, brains that respond strongly to stimulation. That sensitivity can be a strength in many areas of life: creativity, curiosity, emotional awareness. But sensitivity also means the brain reacts more strongly to dopamine rewards, which can make certain habits feel especially gripping.
So the same nervous system that makes someone thoughtful or creative can also make them more vulnerable to high stimulation habits. This isn't good or bad, it's simply wiring. And once people understand this, something important changes. The behavior stops feeling like a moral failure. It becomes a pattern the brain learned, and patterns can be unlearned, but not through shame. Shame usually makes habits stronger, because shame increases stress, and stress is one of the triggers that pushes the brain back into the cycle. What actually breaks patterns is awareness, understanding what emotional state usually appears before the behavior. Many people discover the pattern starts with boredom, or loneliness late at night, or feeling overwhelmed during the day. When the brain senses discomfort, it looks for the fastest relief. So the question becomes less about the behavior itself and more about the feeling that comes before it, because that feeling is the real trigger. Once people start noticing this, something shifts. They begin realizing the urge itself is temporary, like a wave in the nervous system, and waves pass, but only if they aren't immediately acted on. Neuroscientists sometimes describe urges as dopamine predictions. The brain predicts that a certain behavior will bring relief, so it creates the urge. But if the behavior doesn't happen, the prediction slowly weakens. This process is called extinction learning. The brain gradually stops expecting the reward. But extinction only happens when the cycle is interrupted repeatedly, which means quitting pornography and masturbation addiction is rarely about one big decision. It's about many small interruptions, moments where the brain expects the usual behavior and something else happens instead. Maybe the person goes for a walk, maybe they call someone, maybe they simply sit with the discomfort for a few minutes.
At first, the brain resists because it wants the familiar shortcut, but the nervous system slowly adapts. It begins finding new ways to regulate itself, and over time, the urge loses intensity. Research shows that addictions often weaken when people build meaningful routines, not strict discipline, but activities that give the brain natural dopamine, like movement, learning, creativity, and social connection. When the brain gets stimulation from healthier sources, the need for artificial ones slowly reduces. The brain is very adaptable. Scientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change over time. Habits that once felt automatic can slowly fade. It's also important to understand that sexual desire itself is not the problem. The issue begins when stimulation becomes the brain's main way of handling emotions and replaces real connection, rest, and experiences. This doesn't mean someone is broken. It simply means the brain learned a shortcut to deal with uncomfortable feelings, and shortcuts can be replaced. When people step away from these cycles, many notice something interesting. They regain energy, focus, and motivation. Things that once felt dull begin to feel enjoyable again. The most important thing to remember is this: your brain isn't trying to harm you, it's trying to protect you. It just learned a fast way to escape discomfort. Understanding that removes a lot of self-blame, because people rarely change behaviors they hate themselves for, but they often change behaviors they understand. And noticing the pattern is the real step toward changing it. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.